the Union Association kind of amped up the war in the middle of that season and started stealing the best players they could off the National League teams. The National League teams saw that going on. They started stealing players back from the Union Association. There was a full-blown war for players going on while all this was happening. And that's when the Wilmington Club steps into this Union Association. They really kind of walked into this crossfire of a huge war between the existing associations, and they got shocked.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey, gang, what's new? How's it going? My name is Tim Hanlon. Thank you very much for joining us once again into our little journey, our little excursion, our little expressway, shall we say, into the deep, dark annals of sports history. We call it Good Seats Still Available, that curious little podcast journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. We welcome you to the proceedings. We thank you for finding us. And of course, for rating and reviewing us on all those places, Apple Podcasts, etc., telling your friends and family and whatever, social media and stuff. We appreciate you not only finding us, but spreading the word as we reach the tens of thousands now of audience members listening to our little shows every week. And we are just delighted that you have joined us again and that many of your friends are starting to do so too. This week we are sticking with, shall we say, the sport of baseball, and we again go back to the Wayback Machine to a very interesting story back around the late 19th century, and we're talking 1884, which is the time when baseball was really starting to get cooking on the professional level. Obviously, the National League having been founded in 1876, just a few years later, almost 7 years later, you had actually three major leagues at the time. The American Association, which had started a few years after that, and for one interesting and kind of head-scratching year, 1884, a third professional league was popping up, and this was called the Union Association. It only lasted a year. Some would argue it barely lasted a year, and there's even debate within the baseball history circles as to whether the Union Association was indeed a long-lasting, through the eyes of history, professional league. I think through this conversation today with our guest, John Springer, I think you're probably going to say, yes, the Union Association was absolutely for its time, a major league, the third such in the United States, a real testament to the growing interest of the professionalization, shall we say, of the sport of baseball. And the journey that John and I take in our conversation this week is about one of those interesting teams that was for a period of time in the Union Association, but we'll get into when they actually came into it and actually left it. Hint, hint, they were not there at the start of the season, nor were they at the tail end of the season either. And that there was the team called the Wilmington Quicksteps. And Wilmington refers to Delaware, the major city of Delaware. And this is a story of a very fascinating and successful minor league team at the time that got the call, mid-season, if you will, to actually jump up into the major leagues, in this case, the Union Association, and fill in for a team that itself in the Union Association was faltering. The team in Philadelphia called the Keystones, themselves the third best professional baseball team in Philadelphia, third of three, if you will. It's a fascinating story. It's really indicative of lots of different things going on at the time. And John Springer has written a very fun and interesting and I think a story-laden book called Once Upon a Team, The Epic Rise and Historic Fall of Baseball's Wilmington Quicksteps. This is a story of Wilmington, Delaware as a city, its desire to, or its aspiration to become a professional sports city at the time in the late 1800s. It is a story of the third professional league at the time, only lasting a year, that was on the rise and helping players perhaps flex their muscles a bit and make some more money, given an increasing clampdown by owners to perhaps restrict their trade, if you will, and a theme we've heard many, many times before. It is the story of a team, the Quicksteps, that dominated their minor league at the time and got stars in their eyes, shall we say, looking to financially better themselves, perhaps the city as well, and join the ranks of the major leagues. But of course, as we're going to find out, finding it a little harder than they imagined. All of those things just make for a very, very compelling story, an interesting story. And again, if you're not sort of an old-time baseball historian, doesn't matter, because some of these stories are rich and very interesting, and actually very thematic to a lot of the sort of bigger topics that we've discussed and will continue to discuss on this little show in our various exploits, not just in baseball, but all sports. But again, this is our conversation with John Springer, the author of Once Upon a Team, The Epic Rise and Historic Fall of Baseball's Wilmington Quicksteps. That's our conversation coming up in a couple of seconds. It's fun. Stick around. You're going to enjoy it. Let's see. Before we get there, I want to say hello and welcome to a new sponsor. It is oldschoolshirts.com. oldschoolshirts.com. And it is an amazing place. They're based in Cincinnati, Ohio, and our friend P.F. Wilson reached out a couple of weeks ago, having listened to a couple of episodes, and he and the team there are really adept at some very cool sports logo wear from all kinds of leagues and teams and other things in and around sports. You're going to find some very original designs. I mean, look, I was looking just a few minutes ago at some of the very cool things. I mean, all kinds of old teams and leagues and cities. I mean, if you're a Chicago Horizons fan, anybody remember the Chicago Horizons of the Major Indoor Soccer League, a one-year wonder? There's a shirt there for you too. If you're from, let's say you're from Houston and you want that Houston Colt 45s logo shirt, it's there for you. Or perhaps the Houston Aeros of the old World Hockey Association. You're going to find that there too. There's all kinds of fun stuff and to be found at oldschoolshirts.com. And of course, if you use the promo code, guess what that is? Good Seats, you will get a 10% discount from all your purchases. Again, it's oldschoolshirts.com. Our friends in Cincinnati, give them a try. You're going to really love this site. And there's some just great stuff, some great shirts, high quality stuff, and great logos and memories to be had. Oldschoolshirts.com, promo code GoodSeats for 10% off your purchases. And we thank P.F. Wilson and his friends at the site for reaching out and giving us a try. And we're tickled pink to have them as a sponsor, and we welcome them to the fold. Oldschoolshirts.com. Thank you. And also, we also want to remind you that audibletrial.com/goodseats, that's the place to go to get some good quality sampling, if you will, of audio books and audiobook for sure, because you're going to get one free audiobook for trying the service when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. You're going to get 1 month of the service for free. You're going to get a free audiobook download. You can cancel at any time, and that free audiobook download is yours to keep, even if you do cancel. As long as you have that device, that book stays with you, and you can listen to it as long as you need or as often as you want. And again, that's our little gift to you for giving it a try. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. Give that a try. We appreciate that. And again, it's yours to keep, so why not give it a shot? audibletrial.com/goodseats. And of course, we thank our friends at Audible for their continued sponsorship of our little show as well. All right, that's it. Let's get that out of the way. We've done that. Let's wipe the dust off of our feet and let us slide safely into first or maybe second base and get into our conversation about the Wilmington Quicksteps, a very interesting story in the old Union Association. And here's my chat with author John Springer right now. Maybe you could start with regaling our audience a little bit about your your general background. Are you a writer by trade? And maybe you can also skate into your perhaps affliction of being a Mets fan, and we can skate into the topic at hand from that.
Yeah, sure thing. Tim, I'm a writer by trade. That's correct. I came out of school with a English degree and worked at a small daily newspaper in Maryland, doing sports writing as my career got to a start. I kind of morphed over the years, sometimes by necessity, sometimes forced into it. But I moved on to a kind of a small freelance publisher in Wilmington, Delaware, which is where this whole Quicksteps thing started out. And since the last 20 years or a little bit more, I've been in New York as a business writer. I write about the retail food business for a living. So, but journalism all the way through, and I was always a sports guy. I kind of decided early on that the sports writing field wasn't necessarily the best place to make a living, and I kind of supplemented my interest in writing about sports by kind of doing it for free or for fun or whatever. I grew up in New York. I'm a big Mets fan, kind of born into a big Mets fan family. And in the late 90s, I began a kind of a goofy project where I decided, or I thought I knew, what the uniform number of everyone who ever played for the Mets was. And in the sort of the process of trying to figure that out, this was before this information was widely out there, or in some cases even known. Kind of assembled a list that accounted for everybody's uniform number, the dates that they wore them, and then wrote a history of the team that proceeded not chronologically by year, but by number. The idea that I would write, start with chapter 1 and write about Mookie Wilson and the guys who wore number 1 for the Mets, number 2 and Bobby Valentine, and so on up to Turk Wendell at 99. So that was a way I kind of supplemented the way, my regular, day job with these projects that I kind of focused on baseball and sports. The Quicksteps book that I did related to a magazine article I did many years ago, and sort of it stretched back to the time I lived for about 4 years in downtown Wilmington. At the time they were sort of establishing the Wilmington Blue Rocks minor league team. You'll probably know this, but the Blue Rocks that were established in 1993 were a sort of a continuation of a Blue Rocks team that went bankrupt in the mid-50s, I believe. Anyway, finding out about the Wilmington Quicksteps, I kind of went back and it sort of kind of took that information, the emotional meaning of a team in a city and so forth, and kind of put that into the book called Once Upon a Team.
Well, let's talk about Wilmington for a second, right? Having lived there myself, actually, for almost 2 years back in the day, working in marketing and advertising for what then was a giant credit card company called MBNA America.
Sure. Everybody worked for MBNA. Well, I was in Wilmington as well.
It's like that. It was sort of the modern day DuPont in terms of its scale and influence, I guess, into the region. But around 93, I remember very vividly the Blue Rocks coming back to town. But I also get a sense of Wilmington and I grew up in northern New Jersey, the New York City metropolitan area, right? And even growing up on the East Coast and knowing certainly the Boston to D.C. corridor, with New York obviously very much in between, and the great state of New Jersey along the way, even I wouldn't necessarily know a whole lot, or didn't know a whole lot, about Wilmington. Maybe you can give a little bit of a background about sort of the, I don't know, it's inferiority complex perhaps along the Eastern Seaboard.
Yeah. Well, the city itself was smaller and a little bit younger than Philadelphia, which is only about 25 minutes to the north along the water. It's almost exactly midway between Baltimore and Philadelphia, almost exactly midway between New York and Washington. So it was in this path of these great big East Coast cities, but never sort of became a great city itself. And among the things I learned about while researching this book about the Quicksteps was that, at one time, the 19th century, a big, industrial revolution going on. These guys, Wilmington had big league aspirations as a city. They were among the leading cities that exported manufactured rail cars to, cities all over the place. They were able to build not only rail cars themselves, but the parts they assembled there. So they were big in transportation and shipbuilding. You had the DuPonts just north of the city on the Brandywine River, doing dynamite and kind of moving on from there to become a major chemical power. And some of those things were really bringing a lot of growth to the city of Wilmington at the time that I wrote about the team, 1884 season in particular. What happened, a lot of those businesses, in the early part of the 20th century got bought out by larger groups. I'm going to forget the names here off the top of my head, sort of who bought the big rail car company called Harlan and Hollingsworth, which employed thousands of people. These manufacturing concerns kind of fell into other people's control. It was a little bit less sort of relied on the city to kind of provide the labor and sort of the things that were associated with the things they built. For example, the train cars they would build in Wilmington, they would build everything from the car itself, like I said, the parts like the wheels, and then there were a community of artists employed within the city who stitched the furniture, the Morocco factories that made the covering on the seats, the painters and the designers and all that stuff was supported by these big industries by companies that were owned in Delaware. And again, over the years, they got bought out by larger rivals in bigger cities, Chicago, some of the big Midwest steel cities kind of took away a lot of the control of the industries that Wilmington was playing in. And of course, they reinvented themselves over the years. DuPont obviously became a huge thing. And then by the time the 1990s came around, the banking industry and the corporate offices was, a major economic power for them. But at the time, I guess what you'd say is that, its failure to kind of, become the major manufacturing power that it really wanted to be was sort of at the heart of Wilmington kind of staying small the way they were. And, I think to a certain degree that sort of reflected in its struggle to support baseball teams over the years. They've had any number of attempts, many of which I got into in my book that, would ultimately fail either because of lack of support from fans, lack of investment support from the owners, or a combination of them. So you can see, some of the results of that kind of disinvestment in Wilmington that had come over the years, kind of playing itself out, even today. Eventually, General Motors took away their plants, those kinds of things. And then as a result, you've got crime and dwindling population in the city. And those are the things that they struggle with.
Well, now that the Wilmington Chamber of Commerce will completely disinvite either of us into the city, why don't we dial?
It's a wonderful city with a lot of great people.
It is. It's quite charming, actually, and especially as some of the suburban areas a little further north, and some of the it's very underestimated for sure. And it's right on the train.
I lived at 13th and Tatnall, right downtown, and it was a great place to live. I walked to work. There was plenty of a nice kind of old school neighborhood that would remind you of something, much nicer or more desirable in a bigger city like Philadelphia. But it was a great place to live. A lot of, like I said, a lot of great people, and always sort of an aspiration to be better than it was, whether or not they were always successful at sort of being that way.
And I think that's fair. And then maybe we could sort of juxtapose that with sort of the the era of sort of 1883, 1884, when this story sort of gets underway, right? So the aspiration, not limited to industry or status and culture, but also professional, or what was then a burgeoning or beginning, if you will, early stages, professional sports kind of environment. And obviously at that time of that generation, baseball was supreme in the United States as the sport of record. Maybe a little bit of background as to this team known as the Quicksteps, which really didn't start as a major league team. It actually started kind of at the height of some very successful times in the minor leagues.
Yeah, and the Quicksteps as a thing really began back in the 1870s, or maybe even the 1860s, as a local club team, and at that time, teams, there were any number of clubs that would represent neighborhoods or areas or various social clubs that would kind of play among themselves. And there were a number of teams kind of over the years in those kind of proto baseball days where, one amateur team or another would kind of be the champion of the state or what have you. The Quicksteps gained renown in the 1870s for being one of the amateur teams that would travel. They would support themselves with, gate receipts and have banquets and, benefit events like that. And then they take this money and tour. So they would, challenge teams, regionally and further out. And they had a couple of great seasons in the 1870s. For a while, they were going around, the Eastern Seaboard, declaring themselves the champion amateur nine of the United States, which was a matter of debate in some cities. But they got kind of notoriety for that. The Quicksteps I wrote about, by the 1883, they still kind of maintained that name, although the team had gone, quote unquote, gone pro, stopped any, illusion that they were a truly amateur team at that time, and were competing in leagues with fixed schedules and those kinds of things, which didn't really exist, at least for the teams of the city in the 1860s or 70s.
So they were though up to challenging some of their newly professional brethren, shall we say, in other leagues, right?
Yeah. I don't have a great sense of sort of how pervasive leagues really were until, the National League sort of demonstrated that a league with a fixed schedule and a set membership and each team plays the other team, the same number of times, and sort of rules like that demonstrated that was a way to sort of run a season. As you probably know, before then, the National Association of Baseball Clubs, tried a professional league, but again, there was no schedule to it. It was a little bit more haphazard, and there was this idea. One of the interesting things I found out, especially in this amateur era I'm talking about, that a championship in baseball was like a championship in boxing, where, a team beats another team, usually in a series of, best out of three, and then that team is the champion until it's dethroned by another team that can beat them 2 games out of 3. So that was sort of the origin of the Quicksteps declaring themselves amateur champions of the United States. The problem with that, of course, was that, as in boxing or, wrestling on TV, the bad guy can beat the champion, but if it's not a championship match, it doesn't count, right? So that was a determination of the loser in these series quite often. So you could have multiple teams declaring themselves champions and so forth. So, the organized leagues that Wilmington clubs played in, I kind of traced it really just 1 year back, 1883, when they played in the Interstate League, which was a group that had pretty much the same group of clubs that would play in 1884, plus or minus a few.
So interesting. So they're by 1883, they're playing in this thing called the Interstate League, which essentially is one of the sort of supreme, I guess, minor leagues. I think it's also interesting. Quick asterisk though is that, I think it's important to remember, that this is still, 1883, 1884, right? Maybe, if you will, depending on where you draw the line of its origins, right, is only 6 or 7 years into what could arguably be called the professionalization of the sport, right? There was even debate, as to whether how noble a pursuit professionalism in the sport of baseball was at that time, right? It's still very much in its early teething stages, this professional thing.
That's true. Although, one of the interesting things that happened, 1883 is the year that sort of demonstrates that the professionals is a boon for its owners and can be for the cities that they play in, and that kind of ignites this explosion of baseball in 1884 that winds up sort of catching, kind of scooping up the Quicksteps in its wake here. There was the Philadelphia Athletics. I am always going to mess this up because I always forget the actual figure. But the Philadelphia Athletics of 1883, which played in the American Association, reported some, ridiculous profit for that year. And I might have to look up the actual profits that they said that they made that year. But yeah, it was a boon. The way it seems to have worked is that, the National Association clubs, which were sort of a league run by the players for the players. And the big advance of the National League was William Hulbert's, idea that the league really ought to be a cartel run by and for the benefit of the owners. And that was the big difference between, the various leagues. And by 1883, 1884, it was clear that was the place to be if you are, sort of speculating in this idea of making a business of it, or making making your name as a team owner, or making your name as a team player. There were still very good amateur teams out there, teams that didn't play in leagues, but it really seemed like the leagues were the future at that point.
So, all right. So before we get into sort of the a little bit more of the genesis of the Keystones, especially around this time, maybe it's important because it sounds to me that this is also maybe backhandedly a story just as much about, as you're hinting at, the professional sport, if you will, now of baseball, with 2 and arguably now going into 1884, 3 attempts at professional leagues. So maybe a little bit of background as to the leagues that were out there and what this thing called the Union Association was all about, sort of the newbie on the street.
Sure. Yeah. I reel me in if I get too far into the arcane. You know what I mean?
This is part of the tableau that I think this is a puzzle to me, and I think it's really cool to sort of into it.
So National League established 1876. Great, more or less success from the start. As I mentioned, it was kind of run for the benefit of the club. They tried to do things like limit the membership in the organization to cities with 75,000, population and above. They gave clubs the ability to vote down, other guys who kind of encroached in their territories, that kind of thing. And so that established this template for baseball as a sport that could be played within the confines of the league and teams that would play one another on a set schedule. 1882, the American Association is born. That's known as, you probably know, the Beer and Whiskey League. And the American Association was similar to the National League in most respects. One of the big differences was that they played games on Sundays and sold liquor in parks, which was sort of a concession that was granted to the owner of the team in St. Louis that realized that, he got into baseball team ownership because he was a brewer who realized that sales at his tavern went, crazy when the baseball games let out. And so those leagues kind of brokered an uneasy peace over the first couple of years of their existence. They had teams in the same cities in a lot of cases. 1883, like I said, 1883, both leagues, both the American Association and the National League, had scintillating pennant races. The Philadelphia Athletics made a boatload of money, and interest in the game was really, really high. That said, right, there is a millionaire in St. Louis named Henry V. Lucas, who himself wanted to become a National League Baseball team owner for the reasons I just said. Lucas petitioned to get into the National League, but, the league's sort of cartel-like rules, shut him out, essentially. And so what Lucas said was, well, I don't have to, I want to be a team owner. What I'm going to do is have a team, and I'll find 7 other teams, and I'll make an 18 league of my own. And he called it the Union Association. He put teams in most cases in the same cities that had American Association and National League teams. And then in a sort of an attempt to differentiate his league and attract players, he said that he was going to come at contracts a little more friendly than the existing associations did. That was a reference to the reserve clause, which, as you probably know, became an issue of debate in baseball for about 100 more years. But it was really the first war of the reserve clause. So Lucas said, there's going to be no reserve clause in the Union Association. Therefore, I should get a lot of National and American Association players because they're going to have more control of their careers, perhaps make more money, et cetera, et cetera. Lucas signed any number of players over that 1883-84 offseason that were from the National League and American Association. Not all of them stayed with Lucas, and then which was one issue, and that sort of started this battle between the Union Association and the existing association, and they took them very seriously. The American Association expanded by 4 teams that season just to keep interest down in the Union Association challengers. I liken it to, when a hot new microbrew comes into a bar, Budweiser will put out a fake product that resembles it in order to maintain that tap handle, So this is what these guys were doing. So the Union Association started, its play. Lucas's team was stacked with former National League and American Association players. Most of the other teams were, either independent teams or, more or less would be minor league teams, perhaps, in other associations. That 18 league got off to a goofy start. Lucas's team marauded the league. I think they played something like 900 ball, obliterated any pretense of a pennant race in the league. And, for that reason and a number of others, interest in that league was pretty low.
And you had teams kind of just coming and going almost, right? Some of these franchises kind of. Well, they had, Lucas had the Union Association had eight teams to start the season. He had trouble getting an 8th team. They added a team in Altoona, Pennsylvania at the last minute, which was, an amateur, or I guess I call them amateur. They're probably semi-pro club or, a more or less a minor league club, and said, why don't you join our circuit? We can't find anybody else. Well, Altoona's on the way, between Philadelphia and St. Louis. We'll find a place to stop there on the train, whatever. That team didn't belong in bigger cities. That team fell apart. Some of the other Union Association teams, was the loser in a 3-team battle. In Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Keystones of the Union Association were less popular than the Philadelphia Quakers of the National League, who were much less popular than the Philadelphia Athletics of the American Association. In Washington, the
two teams, the American Association team and the Union Association, both struggled because neither of them were any good. And so, yeah, there was at least, let's see, Altoona dropped out almost immediately. I think they lost, I can't remember how many games they lost out of their first and how long they actually lasted. But it was only a matter of weeks.
According to my records, they went 6-19 for a winning percentage of 240.
Right. 240, and most of those losses came against St. Louis, incidentally. So then not only did Lucas stack the St. Louis Maroons with, by far the best talent in that league, but they set it up to play home-and-home series over the first 12 games. So they were destroying these guys by, scores of, 10, 12, 15 runs a game. Yeah, so they dropped out, the Altoona team dropped out almost immediately, and they were replaced by the Kansas City team, the team called the Kansas City Cowboys, who are also not any good, but willing to join the league as a replacement for Altoona. Later in that season, the Chicago team was drawing very poorly. They moved to Pittsburgh, and they drove very poorly there, and they eventually dropped out. And the Philadelphia Keystones, who like I said, were by far the worst and least popular team in Philadelphia, dropped out. And that was the opportunity for the Wilmington Quicksteps to take their place. So,
and we'll use that as a segue, but before we do that, let me ask this sort of general question: is why would Lucas essentially set up a league that at least foundationally was competing directly with one, if not two teams in major markets versus perhaps sprinkling their clubs in maybe some lesser competitive markets, right? To be the third team in Philadelphia just seems like a losing battle from day one.
Yeah. I don't think Lucas was ultimately very sensible about sort of where things went. The league was set up very quickly. There was discussion about where those teams would go. That's the Washington club, the Wilmington club, a few others, may have formed a separate minor league or whatever. But, Lucas was kind of a bold guy. He made these tremendous pronouncements. We're going to take on the National League. Our cause is just. We will beat them. Lucas was also a extremely rich man who could afford this kind of fanciful kind of stuff. And I don't know if he necessarily understood, the economic implications of kind of getting in bed with these teams that were, not prepared to, or owners who were not prepared to support their team in a manner similar to the way Lucas did his team. He built, for example, this elaborate stadium in St. Louis where the Maroons played their home games, and that had amenities that didn't exist then. Like a clubhouse for the players and a billiard room, and all these sort of things that were completely out of line with the folks he were sort of in bed with. And in the final analysis, it was that Lucas wanted to demonstrate to the National League owners that he should be a National League owner. And to an extent, this whole union association thing was a big fiasco to just kind of prove that point for him.
Well, he was also acting as the, the commissioner, the president. He's owning a team, but also double dipping, if you will, as sort of running or trying to keep this thing afloat and alive. And I guess he's the instrumental guy that intervenes when the Philadelphia Keystones start to founder and looks for a replacement in Wilmington. Maybe a little bit of who were the Keystones, where were they going, and how did this sort of reach out to the city to the north in Wilmington sort of come up as an idea to be a replacement?
Well, the popular story is that Wilmington was induced by these sweetheart deal from Lucas. But, what I found in my book, I think is interesting in that, much of the talk, and I'm getting way ahead of the question you asked, much of the talk about Wilmington leading the lead actually was between the Wilmington Club and one of the other club, the Washington Nationals of the Union Association. And their interest wasn't necessarily in, Wilmington's health, but they didn't want to lose home dates against the Philadelphia club. So let me wind back. As I mentioned earlier, the Philadelphia team was bad. The Phillies weren't popular either, but they were drawing better than the Quickstep. The Keystones. The Keystones had sliced their admission price by half. There was only 25 cents to go to the games. Still didn't help. The team didn't win any games. That was their problem. I believe Philadelphia played something like 300 ball for most of the year. They were on their knees for a while. When they finally gave up the ghost, there was talk that Wilmington could replace them in the schedule. So Wilmington made that decision after several discussions with William Warren White, who was in charge of the Nationals team in the Union Association. Wilmington had their own reasons for making the move. For all their success, they were not drawing well. They had, walloped the teams in their minor league. Wilmington was, at the time they made the jump to the Union Association, their magic number was 1, right? They would have clinched the division with one more win or one more loss from the team behind them. They were tearing it up, if you will, in the Interstate League, right? So the Interstate League, which was renamed the Eastern League in 1884. Yeah, the Wilmington was 51-12 at the time they made the move. So that's better than 800 ball. The fans had basically stopped coming out to the games because the results were a foregone conclusion. The Eastern League was having the same problems that the Union Association was having, in that there was a competitive imbalance that deadened the interest in a pennant race. Some of the teams just weren't financially or well run operationally, and we're up against one team that was run well operationally. That was the Quicksteps. They had dominated their league. There was really very little drama in their games throughout the year. They had a terrific team. They had a very good manager, and they were having a lot of success.
So it sounds to me like it's a little combination of hubris and flattery, and maybe. And there was financial
opportunity,
right? Yeah.
Yes. Well, there was plenty of financial opportunity. Like I said, the Wilmington team was kind of operating in the red from the start of the year, and that's because they went out and kind of bought players. They bought the best players out of the Interstate Association of 1883. They simply got a head start on everybody else, and had assembled their team basically by November, while the others were still figuring out who was gonna support them that year. But the story goes that the Wilmington owner, a man named John West, said that William Warren White of the Union Association had agreed that they would they would pay the team's expenses for road trips if they made the trip, and that they would get, in some cases, I believe 50% of the gate receipts at the games that they played in. And from West's point of view, if that were true, that would kind of pull them out of their financial issues that they were facing and kind of get them through to the end of the year. So that was the question is whether that was really ever offered. Although it was widely reported at the time, nobody ever disputed it until long after the season. And Lucas said he had never heard of the Wilmington team, and denied making any of those offers. It's hard to say whether that was actually a thing or just something that John West told the Wilmington people because he was worried that, the team that he was supporting was going to go bankrupt in the middle of this great season they were having.
But what is factually true, though, is that they were, the Quicksteps, in exhibition form, playing and beating the Nationals of Washington and the Baltimore Monumentals in the Union Association. So there was, I guess, on some level, some familiarity and maybe even, so we say backward or backhanded comfort in knowing that this is a team that conceivably could step in and be quality competition.
Correct. And the fact of the matter is that the Quicksteps were competitive with some teams, at least could be, and not only that when they had these off-day exhibitions, the team would draw much better than they would in these league games, which were no contest. If people weren't interested in seeing a baseball game where they knew who was going to win before it started, especially given, the gamblers' interest in baseball at that time. So what the Quicksteps did, and Wilmington's, enviable geographic positioning between Baltimore, Philly, Washington, New York, trainloads of professional ball players out of 3 leagues would be passing through Wilmington every week. So when they had mutual off days, the Wilmington club would schedule these guys to come in for a game. They would draw much better and give the fans a show. And it definitely built a confidence that Wilmington was a team that could play with these guys. When they could. Probably the most famous game that they played against a team was when the New York Mets of the American Association stopped in Wilmington. The Quicksteps beat them 5-4, beat Tim Keefe, the Hall of Fame pitcher for the New York team. So, yeah, it was definitely this idea, I think selling it to the fans wasn't such a big deal. But, whether the Union Association liked Wilmington so much that they would pay for these guys to take a train out to Cincinnati and Kansas City, to just to have them play, that is in question. I think story was told by Wilmington. Is it true? It's hard to say. It's hard to believe.
All right, time for me to catch my breath, get a cool, tasty beverage, and remind you, while we do so, that our friends at Audible are here to remind you that you can get a free audiobook download of your choice from over 180,000 titles. If you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats and use that link, of course, to try for yourself a free audiobook on us, gratis, if you will. And you will love the idea of audiobooks. It's an awesome way to kill time and occupy and stimulate your mind, perhaps when your eyes are busy doing something else. And of course, there are plenty of interesting books to be found, especially in the world of sports and sports history. And I think our audience might enjoy a few of these, of course, including the seminal work by baseball legend Jim Bouton. It's called Ball 4. It is not only written, but it's also narrated by him. You could use your free credit for that book. And of course, as you know, Ball 4 centers around the 1969 one-year wonder that is the Seattle Pilots of Major League Baseball, but obviously the background for a whole lot of other observations about the sport of baseball. And it remains to this day perhaps one of the most celebrated writings about the sport of baseball in this country. Of course, you can also, if you're not a big baseball fan, you can go into the world of soccer with the autobiography called My Turn by Johan Cruyff, the late Johan Cruyff, perhaps one of the world's best ever soccer players. He of Dutch heritage, of course. Plenty of great legendary years at club play as well as national team play for the Dutch team, as well as, for our audience, maybe a little bit of interest, his journeys in the North American Soccer League in the late 70s and early 80s with the Washington Diplomats and the Los Angeles Aztecs. And of course, if you're into football, there's probably no better book, especially if you find yourself really interested in the sort of deep and rich history of the NFL, with the book called NFL Football, A History of America's New national pastime. It is written by Richard Crepeau and narrated by Marlon May. That, too, is an audiobook that you could choose from over, like I said, 180,000 titles. There's got to be something in there that's going to be of interest to you. And by all means, give it a try. And we appreciate your doing so at audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you're going to get your free audiobook download. You can cancel it anytime. And again, even if you cancel it, you can keep that book as long as your device exists. So again, we appreciate it. Give it a try. audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now back to our conversation. Well, okay, so come August or so, right? The jump is made, right? So based on my little crack research here, that the Keystones effectively folded on the 7th of August, 1884, which, not necessarily a surprise because there were a whole bunch of other Union Association teams, as you were hinting at before, that had already stumbled and failed and sort of gone their own respective ways out of the league by that time. But this is about when the Quicksteps step up, shall we say, into, I guess, to fill in the gap. And I guess, it seems to me like, all right, well, maybe the Union Association feels a little shaky, but it is arguably at least on certain levels of perception, a third professional league. It's part of the times, and professional baseball is growing. Lots of interest. It seems like I don't want to call it a no-brainer, right? Obviously, you mentioned some of the financial challenges that the Wilmington Club had as well. But from all accounts, it seems to me like why wouldn't you try to make this happen, given especially the tantalizing successes that you've had in the exhibition world?
Totally, yeah. I think on a baseball, the Wilmington Club was good enough to play in the Union Association from day one. So that made a lot of sense. The Union Association as a thing by the time the Wilmington Club came along was wobbly in as much as I mentioned before, there was really no pennant race to be had. Really for the Wilmington fans, it was an idea. It was this idea of getting better competition in there to draw more fans to the club. Wilmington. I don't argue that at all. Wilmington can and did kind of play with the best teams in baseball that year. Would they beat them all the time? No. Would they have finished in first place if they played in the National League? No. They probably would have been near the end. But they weren't as bad as many of the Union Association clubs were. The other thing that we really haven't gotten into yet, that was sort of a reason against joining the Union Association was that there was this massive player war going on between them and the National and American associations at that time. So as I mentioned earlier, this reserve clause issue that the Union Association was backing, that became something that the existing leagues really worried about. The Union Association felt that they passed this thing called the Day Resolution, the existing groups that would ban a player for life if they jumped the contract and went to a non-league team, and that scared a lot of the players away. The Union Association kind of amped up the war in the middle of that season and started stealing the best players they could off the National League teams. The National League teams saw that going on. They started stealing players back from the Union Association. There was a full-blown war for players going on while all this was happening. And that's when the Wilmington Club steps into this Union Association. They really kind of walked into this crossfire of a huge war between the existing associations, and they got shot.
Well, it sounds like it was not a bad time to be a player because you've got now 3 entities bidding for services, no?
Yeah. Every time that happens in baseball history, you've seen it, right? Salaries go up. The threat of the Continental League in 1960, or the what do you call it? The Players Brotherhood League in 1890,
yep.
Right? Federal League, right? Every time that accompanies this insane, jump in salaries, and usually from, what you would consider, in retrospect to be like paltry wages to better wages, right? So, even over the course of the 84 season, the Quicksteps had players whose salaries more than doubled during the course of that year.
Well, all right, let's talk about some of the players, right, and the sort of the characters, because before we sort of get into their downfall, and I think to put this in perspective for our audience, right, the team is basically stepping up to the Union Association in the first or second week of August of 1884. They only lasted in the Union Association until the third week of September of 84, right? So, but maybe before we get to why the quick demise. How about some of the players that kind of got them to this spot in the first place? Because obviously they were doing quite well in the Eastern League before they made the jump, right? And obviously for a good reason. That's why they were invited in some respect.
Absolutely. It started with the manager. His name was Joe Simmons. He was kind of a forgotten figure in the early baseball career, but Joe Simmons was named the manager. He had managed the Trenton team in the Interstate League in 1883. He was hired by Wilmington to be their manager, basically, the day after the 1883 season started. Simmons was a pro ball player whose career went back to, cricket in the New York area, played with all these legendary teams, the Unions of Morsania and the Chicago White Stockings of 1870, and, all these kind of legendary teams in the past. He's an older guy, 38 years old, I guess at the time, knew the talent very well. You got to understand this was before you could look up a player's stats on your phone, or consult a scouting bureau for a report on these guys. So there was no experience really for the no substitute for the experience that a guy like Simmons had. He knew the league very well, knew the players very well, and went out and basically signed an all-star team of Interstate Association ball players that off-season. The best of those was a young infielder from the Harrisburg team named Tommy Burns, popularly known as Oyster Burns. Burns was, at that time he played shortstop, he pitched, he did a little bit of outfield. He's mostly a shortstop and outfielder. Tremendously strong, tough, violently tempered guy. Played for, they say played for all he was worth. He ran hard. You'll see some pictures if you look them up online of Oyster Burns. There's one from the 1889 Brooklyn team that he winds up with. He's sitting cross-armed in front of a team portrait. And you look at his forearms, and they're as big as my thighs, right? They were like, he was like Brian Downing, Popeye. This is 100 years before stories. Strong guy. Real power hitter in the, when there wasn't a whole lot of power hitters in baseball.
How did he get the name Oyster?
Pardon? Oyster. It was given to him late in his career, and I think it was a name that he was known more for by historians necessarily than he was during his playing career, although the reason for that was that there were two players named Tommy Burns who played at the same time. One was a infielder with the Chicago team in the National League. So there were two Tommy Burns. I think to distinguish them, they called him Oyster Burns. Yeah, they called him Oyster Burns, I'm pretty sure, because of his association with the Baltimore Orioles, who he played with for a couple of years following Wilmington. Well, Baltimore is famous for its oysters, and that was his name. I feel like he was a hard-shelled and salty player. It's kind of a great nickname for him in retrospect. I don't know if that's the reason why, but he was the best player in the Eastern League by a long shot, and he belonged in the major leagues even at though he was 19 years old and had a little some growing up to do as far as his sort of behavior on the field went. Burns, they had two other excellent hitters on that team. One was Dennis Casey, who was an outfielder. He hit 370 in Eastern League play that year. Singles hitter, but a good singles hitter. And they had a player named Tom Lynch, another tough Irishman, a pretty good left-handed hitter, and had some power. So they had an offense, you know, at a time when, you know, I mean, they call it the dead ball era. This was not a home run hit. You know, home runs weren't the thing then necessarily. The Wilmington team hit home runs. You know, they were kind of an offensive-minded team at certain positions. And then, you know, their real secret ingredient was the pitcher. His name was Edward Nolan. People remember him as the only Nolan. And Nolan was a real special case in the Eastern League because he had actually had several years of major league experience or playing with the best pros in the game. But Nolan had a notorious history of drinking and discipline problems and gambling. Gambling suspicions. They never pinned anything on him, but they believed he threw games. And he had been suspended by baseball and blacklisted at least 3 times by the time Wilmington reached out to him just before the season began. So Nolan was basically considered unemployable. And Simmons, to his credit, knew Nolan because they had played together many years before on a team in Indianapolis, I believe. And Nolan kind of rehabbed his image and his drinking problems in Wilmington that year. And he was a magnificent pitcher who was good enough to beat these teams. Wilmington doesn't stand a chance against the New York Mets if Nolan isn't pitching. So they also had a couple of other guys with decent major league careers ahead of them. One was the left-handed pitcher Dan Casey, who I mentioned his brother Dennis was an outfielder. Dan was very young at that time, but he had a decent career, 7-8 years ahead of him with the Phillies. Charlie Bastian was the second baseman. He was never a great hitter in the major leagues, but is considered by a lot of historians as probably the best defensive middle infielder of the era that he played in. So again, Simmons had these, picked his talent pretty well, and they all performed pretty well. He kept the team together kind of harmoniously, and they were just a powerhouse.
Is there any truth to the rumor? And this is again another piece of crack research. So
Sure.
Take it for what it's worth, because who knows where it's coming from. Dennis Casey, is he the proverbial Casey at the bat from?
That's a great question. Yeah, it was actually Dan Casey, his younger brother, the pitcher, who said that he was the mighty Casey. Of course, that was not true. And I think, Casey sort of knew it was not true, but he kind of played up the rumor anyway. It got reported, I don't know exactly when, the 20s maybe, or the 1920s. Dan Casey lived very long, and into his 80s, and sort of playing along with this myth. When the Baseball Hall of Fame opened, and they're celebrating this other myth, right? That Abner Doubleday invented baseball in Cooperstown, New York. They said, "Hey, well, let's bring out the original Casey from the poem." But there's no way that poem was about Dan Casey. He just said so, and people love a myth, and they bought it up, they ate it up. Dan Casey, when he was honored there at the Hall of Fame opening, was given a lifetime pass. He could go to any baseball game he wanted to, and it's a great story. But like many great stories, there's no truth to it at all.
What there is truth though, is that a whole lot of the players abandoned ship pretty quickly. What's with that, right? I mean, I could see maybe the tantalizing dollars of the Union Association, but arguably the team is now in the Union Association.
Correct.
So why would they leave, given the chance to be in the quote-unquote pros now?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier, there was this major player war going on between the associations at that time, and kind of crossing over to enemy lines made the players, especially those with major league aspirations, sort of vulnerable, and they didn't want to be associated necessarily with this rebel league that was bringing war on the ball players. Burns, like I said earlier, was a good enough player to play in the major leagues that year. He jumped after one game. He was offered the opportunity to go over to the Baltimore Orioles, and in whatever it was, the remaining 7 weeks of the American Association season, he ended up finishing second in the league in home runs. So, and his salary more than doubled, I guess, as a result of making that jump. So Burns went. Dennis Casey went along with him. The story is actually that Baltimore asked Tom Lynch to come with Burns, but Lynch, for whatever reason, didn't want to go to the Orioles, and so they took Dennis Casey instead. When Dennis Casey left, the ball players were resentful of Dennis Casey getting this opportunity that the rest of them didn't, because I don't think they liked Dennis Casey all that much. Dan Casey then kind of left the team in shame, basically, after his brother left. So those three were off right away. The other problem was that Nolan, the pitcher, and his favorite catcher, Tony Cusick, were tempted at that time to join the Phillies in the National League. And there's quite a bit of kind of story behind that. But the story is that those guys went to, instead of reporting to Wilmington's first game in the Union Association, they went instead to a tryout with the Phillies in Philadelphia. But Nolan never signed with Philly, and he never signed with the Union Association. He kind of was playing them off one another, and eventually he wouldn't join Philly. Cusick wanted to join Philly, but couldn't because they didn't think he was worth anything without Nolan. So these guys kind of held out for a couple of days. Nolan was gone for almost, I don't want to say, he didn't rejoin the team until the 29th of August. So, and by then Wilmington had gone through this terrible stretch without their best pitcher, losing their best hitter, their second best hitter. They were in a shambles by the time Nolan came back. So, Nolan could have joined Philadelphia. He was a crafty kind of guy. He was playing the leagues off one another and doing his best to get a salary increase the best he could, which he eventually got from Wilmington and in the Union Association.
Well, I think it's also important to kind of get a sense of how much money we're talking about, right? So again, I've been looking at I think this is an entry in this might have been Wikipedia, so you got to take this with a grain of salt. But
Sure.
and we all know that the amount of what the dollars were like in the 1880s are certainly very different today. But in terms of percentage, right? My understanding that some of these players were basically making about $100, $150 a month in Wilmington, and you're talking about I think Oyster Burns looked at jumping to the Baltimore Monumentals for something like $900 a month, right? Which is just a gigantic raise. I think Dennis Casey was looking at Baltimore for $700 a month. Not bad when you're making $150.
Yeah.
In the midst of
some of that is No, you're absolutely right. The salary increases were huge. I'm not sure whether that $700, $900 is a month or for the rest of the season, which was about 2 months. But either way, these guys were doubling their salaries in the jump. So, yeah, it was worth it to them. And again, in the case of Burns, he was just a good player. I mean, it was, you couldn't, if you could imagine present day, you've got a AAA hitter, who's hitting 400 and murdering the league. The team's not going to cry when he's called up to the big leagues. It's just going to happen. There was no stopping Burns' career. It was the other guys, that was sort of kind of caught up in the whole thing that were, they kind of tore the team apart. And like I said, Burns was also the team captain. He kept everybody in line. He was a demonstrative, shrill voice, little bit of a disciplinarian, so to speak. Team captains at that time were more or less like the managers that we think of today, right? They set the lineups. It was their responsibility to argue with umpires, those kinds of things. So Burns was really the soul the offense anyway of the Quickstep team, and Nolan was their best pitcher by a long shot. So without those two, they were not the same team. Once they turned pro, so they got worse. The higher they got, the worse the team got.
Well, it seems to me that not only did they not handle the opportunity or the ability to, they couldn't handle losing those quality players, number one. But it also seems to me that, and maybe this is in retrospect, right? They're essentially jumping up into the union association when it's clear that St. Louis has already running away with the pennant in this crazy league, and it's almost like they're acting as filler, right? So I don't know. Yeah. You put those two pieces together, the lack of star talent that's sort of dissipating elsewhere, and why even bother, given that the whole season's already wrapped up, if you will. You think that was, or are there other things that conspired to them not even making the end of the union association season?
Oh, well, yeah, there was economic problems. I mean, that was why they made the jump in the first place, right? Among the other things that they knew that they could count on as a union association team was that Henry Lucas's St. Louis Maroons would come to Wilmington for a 4-game series in a couple of weeks, right? So here, then the team could say, hey, here are these great players. They're coming out to the city. Come on out to the ballpark. Come on, see them, those kinds of things. I think two things took this, the Quicksteps by surprise. One, they did not expect to be caught up in the player war the way they did. There were any number of entreaties to kind of get their players over the course of the season that were not successful. Nolan was offered a contract by the Phillies much earlier in that season, didn't take it. Again, I think they were surprised that their ball players didn't, were picked off as suddenly as they were. It was an economic problem. They did not have, the Quicksteps didn't have enough money left in their coffers to pay the opposing team their guarantee of the gate receipts at home, much less, take a 16-game road trip to Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Kansas City, which was on the schedule, ahead of them on the schedule. And again, they had perpetuated this myth that the Union Association was going to pay for that. Whether that was true or not, the fact of the matter is the Union Association didn't pay it and wouldn't pay it. And before they even got to that point, the Quicksteps had gone bankrupt.
And they only won 2 of their 18 games, so must have been a very inspiriting experience.
Yeah, and they won their first. And that was the game that was the game that Oyster Burns played in, and Dan and Dennis Casey. Dan Casey pitched. Dennis Casey was in the outfield. Oyster Burns was a shortstop. They didn't have Nolan. They didn't have Cusick, but they won that game. They were demoralized by the Burns departure. And I had a rough time kind of filling in the roster. Teams only had 11 or 12 guys at any one time at that time, right? They didn't need to employ 25, So you miss 1 or 2 players, you'd have to kind of pull whoever was available. So, in the middle of this season, the week that they started playing Union games, it was in Washington. It was 95 degrees out, and in the middle of this sickening heat wave. They have to find who's ever available, to play first base or to play shortstop or to pitch because they don't have Nolan or Burns there. Would employ these guys. His name's escaping me at the moment. Who came in, pitched, disappeared with his reserve money afterwards. His advanced salary afterwards. And those are the kinds of things. So they were kind of relying on it. One account has Joe Simmons, 38 years old, playing third base in a game, and none of the baseball encyclopedias reflect this, but my research indicates that Simmons actually suited up and played third base in one of those games in Washington because they were so shorthanded. The other problems, Wilmington was not used to traveling so much. You know, their longest trip until now was to Richmond. Basically from Washington, in order to make the Union schedule, they had to get from Washington to Boston. Their train arrived too late in Boston. They hadn't any experience traveling to Boston before. They arrived too late to get charged with a forfeit. Again, they kind of patched together a team. Some of these guys had drinking problems, discipline issues, because they were ball players who were available in the middle of the season. One of them is a gentleman named John Cullen. Cullen was an outfielder and a catcher. Cullen got drunk after a game in Wilmington, came home to the club hotel, walked into an empty elevator shaft, fell 20 feet to the ground, suffered back injuries, couldn't play again for the rest of the year. That kind of stuff happened. There was a gruesome incident that happened while Wilmington was hosting the team from Cincinnati, the Outlaw Reds, in which the umpire got struck by a foul ball shot off the bat, hit him in the mouth, fell to his back, almost died of suffocation. If there weren't for a doctor who happened to be at the game that day, it would have been baseball's first on-field fatality. The newspaper said that people were getting sick. The scene was so gruesome on the field. Those kinds of things hurt the attendance. The people didn't want to come back and see that kind of stuff. What was
the final straw in September that sort of where they gave up the ghost?
Well, they gave up the ghost. I mean, I wish there was something that was dramatic, but they didn't. I mean, the accounts I read would say they did not draw enough people to the game to pay Kansas City, who was visiting that day, their $75 guarantee. The owners were out of money. The team, Gate wasn't generating enough to pay him $75. Simmons pulled the men off the field and disbanded then and there. The other thing was, again, if West was lying the whole time about this story that Lucas was going to pay their way to do their Western trip, which was coming up, or whether Lucas said yes, we will. He didn't intend to. He was already recruiting a team in I guess it was Milwaukee to take the Quicksteps' place when that road trip began, and that's exactly what they did. So the Quicksteps knew that they were being replaced, and they knew that they hadn't drawn enough fans at the game. They also knew that Burns wasn't coming back, and everything else. So I think they just kind of gave it up then.
So I mean, what is the epitaph for all this? I mean, you've got the city of Wilmington sort of gets its taste of, I guess, at least for the 1 year, the professionalism of what some would argue was a third professional league at the time. Obviously, they had been quite successful in the minor leagues the year and a half prior, so to speak. Obviously, they weren't prepared for, a 3-league bidding war for players and all that kind of stuff. But was there any, based on your research, is there any thought about somehow, taking another stab at it, either in the union association, which I know at least a couple of clubs tried to sort of soldier on for another season, but it didn't occur. Was there any thought that Wilmington could at least somehow at least get back into the minor leagues? It seems like there was.
Well, they did. They did the following year under the same owner. Don West got some investors together and tried to get a team together. Although that team also drew poorly, was not as successful as the Quicksteps as a baseball thing. They drew very poorly, and they relocated to Atlantic City halfway through the season. That league, I don't believe that was the Eastern League. That might have been a different league, but it was purely minor league at that time. Here's the other interesting thing that I didn't mention that you'll probably find pretty interesting was that during the season, before this whole union association situation came up, there was a team in the Eastern League named the Richmond Virginians. And as you know, that they moved to the American Association. So they stepped up from the minor leagues to the major league earlier that season. and took the place of the disbanded Washington team in the American Association. That team went bankrupt. The Washington team in the American Association was one of several teams that they added to that league in order to clamp down competition for the Union Association. That team was a failure. Richmond made the move to the American Association. Before they did that, though, they called Wilmington, or I don't know if they couldn't have telephone. They telegraphed Wilmington and proposed that the teams merge and go together into the American Association. And that would have been interesting because Richmond had 3 or 4 players who actually had a decent major league career ahead of them as hitters. Wilmington had the pitching. Wilmington had Burns. Wilmington had the superior manager and Joe Simmons. Had they been able to come to an agreement and throw a team up there in the American Association, that would have been interesting to see. As it went, the Richmond team did very poorly in the American Association.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, because the Maroons, who ran away with it in the Union Association, actually made the jump to the National League the next season for a couple of seasons.
Correct.
And I think Lucas got his wish, but maybe didn't last all that long, from what I understand.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was all Lucas wanted in the first place. I think he talked a good game. Maybe he believed, personally in this idea that the reserve clause was unjust and everything else. But that didn't stop him. When he got the offer to get to the National League, he went to the National League, and he left his fellow owners in the Union Association, primarily the Cincinnati Outlaw Reds owners, completely in the lurch. Those guys were the Reds, although they had no ability to kind of reel in the St. Louis club. That club took this player war as seriously as anybody. They reeled in a bunch of National League players over the course of that season, and were making a real go of it. By the time the Union Association blew up, the Reds were probably the best team in the league, but left them completely in the lurch. These guys were completely screwed by Lucas's decision, to go to the National League. And yeah, his team only lasted a couple of years. They had problems. One of the things was that it wasn't really the Maroons that moved. It was Lucas was able to acquire the struggling Cleveland team in the National League and move it. So he didn't have a very good team. And then Lucas ended up squandering his fortune on a number of things over the years, and he actually died a poor man, if not a penniless man. So he had all kinds of issues ahead of him.
Lesson learned: when you inherit money, friends,
Yeah.
Well, so it's, I know that time is, or history is in hindsight, right? And you 2020, etc.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's the cynic almost in me. Well, I was going to say that in some respects, maybe you tell me, you're the expert. That the Wilmington Quicksteps story almost is feels almost like a contributing element to really a bigger story about Henry Lucas's desire to be in the National League as an owner.
Yeah. I mean, there were a lot of victims, right? Yeah. I mean, that's true. I think the Quicksteps are really sort of victims of their own desire for success in a similar way that, Lucas was sort of done in for his own success. If Lucas's league was to be successful, his team could not have been that successful. He overdid it, right? The Quicksteps built a team that was way better than any Eastern League team that year. They almost overshot the goalpost. You know what I mean? And I think they almost tried so hard to succeed that they failed. Both Lucas and Wilmington, really, because the Wilmington owner, again, he also, may have suffered some certain delusions of grandeur, and the thing I say in the book really is that the thing that Lucas and John West really share in common more than anything else is they were both absolute fools for baseball. They loved it. The game was exploding. They very much wanted to be a part of it. They very much wanted to be successful at it. And again, they succeeded so outrageously they failed.
Last question. Any remnants or of the history of this team, aside from obviously your book? Is there anything in Wilmington or the Blue Rocks? Is there any sort of deference or historical plaques or any memories or recountings of this story, or is it?
There should be, don't you think?
Well, it sounds interesting. It sounds like a lot of these stories, frankly, that we get into, especially some of the older ones, almost feel like they're, at the very least, fodder for a serialization, if you will, with a little bit of dramatic license. I mean, I can hear the pianos and the saloons, right? Playing in the background, and you can kind of create a little story around some of these guys with these great names like Oyster, Burns, and the only Nolan. I mean, just the names themselves evoke interesting.
I'm totally with you. I think if any filmmakers listening out there, please buy the rights to this story. You could cast a bunch of good-looking young men and make a box office killing. No, but in Wilmington, it's hard to say. Every 10 or 12 years, somebody brings this up. This book itself was based on my coming across this story 15 years before and wrote a magazine article that it was published in Wilmington. And, that's based on, articles that you see in the News Journal archives every 10 or 12 years or 15 years. But yeah, I mean, it is, in my estimation, an underreported phenomenon that a city as small as Wilmington, at one time had a major league team. I mean, that bit itself was so astonishing that's what sort of made me want to do this story, even before I knew how sort of extraordinary it was. Just that is mind blowing, and so no, I don't know if there's anything that commemorates that team. The hotel where the players stayed still stands. It's now known as the Queen Theater. The Blue Rocks Stadium stands on the grounds where the Harlan and Hollingsworth Corporation made the rail cars and the boats, and really where all the fans for the old, team worked. But, the Blue Rocks, to my knowledge, haven't done anything on this. I mean, it seems to me to be a natural, throwback day, right? I've got some information about sort of what their uniforms looked like, that kind of stuff. It would be awesome. And, but yeah, does Wilmington recognize it? I don't know.
All right. Well, let's get some promo stuff for you. Give me here's your chance to just tout the book. Give us the name, where it's available, and all that kind of good stuff, and maybe other things that you might be also thinking about or working on.
Yeah. Well, the book is called Once Upon a Team. It was published by Sports Publishing LLC. It's available in bookstores, particularly around Wilmington, or online, any of your online stores. You can order a copy from me directly if you want to reach me. I'm at springer66.net. I've got a website where I've been writing a little bit about the stories I'm telling in the book. I tweet mostly about the Mets, something about my book at Springer66. I'm known a little bit for having done Mets by the Numbers, the book, which is the online repository of Mets uniform number history, and that's available at mbtn.net.
And MBN as in Nancy T.net. It's if you call yourself a New York Mets fan, and I grew up basically as a Mets fan after having become a turncoat from a Yankee fan in 1986, because obviously the Mets were an exciting franchise at the time, and I never kind of really looked back. It is a quintessential must read if you're a Mets fan. So that's called Mets by the Numbers. So any other things in your wheelhouse that you're contemplating in the sport of baseball or otherwise?
I am, but I don't know quite what they're going to be yet. What I'm hoping to do here with, this book, which, obviously has a kind of a limited kind of built-in audience, is just kind of build some momentum toward the ability to kind of plow into another project. So I love baseball. I like telling stories. I definitely I had a good time with this. I might want to look into it a little bit more contemporary story next time, but I hope to have something at some point. Let's put it that way.
Well, it's a very interesting story, and I especially enjoyed your the preface of the book when you were talking about the big Macmillan baseball encyclopedia that your dad brought home one day. For those old enough to know, I mean, this was this is obviously before a lot of the online and internet stuff. I mean, we're talking, think of the largest dictionary you could, right? That might sit in a library and maybe double or triple the size of it. When you're a kid, you see this baseball encyclopedia. It's a gargantuan. I don't even think they publish it anymore, but I can.
It's completely mind-boggling, though, right?
Yeah,
and you just get this idea that you've got a big collection of Topps baseball cards. You think what there is to know about baseball, and boy, are you wrong, right? I mean, it's just so much. There's so much out there. I guess one of the cool things about this book is maybe it demonstrates to people that there are stories out there in the most obscure, arcane baseball episodes. I certainly found a good story here, and I kind of like it for a lot of reasons, but look, if a minor league baseball team from the 19th century can be written about, you figure like there's a lot of stuff that can be written about.
All right, there you go. Wilmington, Delaware Blue Rocks fans of the Carolina League. There's your entree into the past history of Wilmington professional baseball. And perhaps a little bit of a door opener, shall we say, into a little bit of that history that preceded the Blue Rocks arriving on the scene and successfully so in the minor leagues. Perhaps a little throwback, a little remembrance, little memory could be served by going back into the Wilmington Quicksteps story, and perhaps some goodness to be had there as we enjoyed that journey back with John Springer. And the book, as we hinted at, is called Once Upon a Team, The Epic Rise and Historic Fall of Baseball's Wilmington Quicksteps. It is published by Sports Publishing, LLC. It came out just about 2 months ago, and it's a very fun read. And you can hear, as I sort of hinted at during our conversation, you can hear sort of the pianos and the clinking of glasses and the murmur in the saloons, if you will, of that era and of that time. And the writing is poignant. It's great. It's fun. And look, I think some great stories that we just scratched the surface of. And look, really indicative of a whole bunch of just amazing twists and turns of the sport of baseball in the early days. A lot of which has been sort of overlooked or sort of glossed over, but some real characters and some real seeds of some of the stuff that baseball's gone through over the years, including things like management, restricting players from moving around to different teams, and all kinds of other sort of bigger issues that obviously have taken on much larger dimensions as the years have gone on. But always fun, always interesting. And yes, we can now check the box. Wilmington, Delaware, and the Wilmington Quicksteps of the old 1 year only Union Association of 1884. And that's what we do here. We knock another one down and more to come on this little show. We appreciate your listening. By all means, give us a rating or review, will you? Go to Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get the show. Rate it, review it, and of course, tell your friends. That's how we get found. That's how we get recommended. It helps the algorithm out, and we obviously want to get more people out there to hear and enjoy the show, hopefully like you do as well. We also want to remind you that we are found early and often on Twitter at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. We're on Instagram. Well, we say that on Instagram. We're on Facebook. Yeah, that's it. The sister company, there you go, of Instagram. We have a page devoted to us there. You'll find us there as well. Our email address is hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And obviously that website is where you can go if you forgot all that stuff. Goodseatsstillavailable.com. You'll find all of our old episodes. You'll find links to the books and all kinds of fun imagery and stuff. You can sign up for our newsletter, all that good stuff. So visit there early and often, bookmark it, and please, by all means, send us a note and let us know what you think. And lastly, but not leastly, we want to thank our friends at Podfly Productions, podfly.net. It's the place to go to help you get up and running in the world of podcasting like they've helped us do for the last year and a half. And of course, we want to tip our baseball cap to our good friend Jerry Payne, who puts our pieces together every week. Thanks, Jerry, and to Podfly Productions, again, podfly.net. Okay, I'm done. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you or hear you or speak to you, that's it, next week. And we appreciate your listening. Good night, everybody. Or good morning, good afternoon, whatever it is. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.